I just would like to start by thanking the Institute of Arts and Humanities and the European Studies Program for making this possible, and also to Anna-Marie Bonviache for helping us setting up the event. I'd like to extend a special welcome to my MMW students here from this lower division world history course. I've told them that one of the benefits of being at a research university is that it's possible to attend these talks and that there are a lot of interesting people coming through. And today we have a very interesting speaker, and I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Paul Betts here from St. Antony College at the University of Oxford. We would prefer to have him here in person, but Zoom is the second best thing, I think, under the current circumstances, but I hope that we'll be able to get him here at some point in the future. So I have to confess that Paul is really one of my favorite historians in the field. I have not read anything by him that is not innovative and original and thought-provoking. So he has a very extensive list of publications. He's published 3 monographs and co-edited no fewer than 7 volumes. And let me just mention the titles of his monographs. The first book was The Authority of Everyday Objects, A Cultural History of West German Industrial Design, published by UC Press in 2004. Then the second monograph, Within Walls, Private Life in the German Democratic Republic, published by Oxford University Press. It won the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History of the Wiener Library in London. And then most recently here, Ruin and Renewal, Civilizing Europe After World War II, published just last year by Basic Books in this country. And this, of course, is also the book that we'll be talking about today. And the format we agreed on was that we would say Paul would give a short introduction to the book. Then I will ask him some easy and lowball questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you for comments and questions. So Paul, welcome, and the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you so much, Frank, for the invitation and the introduction, and also agreeing to serve as a kind of discussant for this presentation today. I know everybody's suffering from various degrees of Zoom fatigue, so we thought it would be best if I just give kind of 10 to 15 minutes as a kind of overview of some of the main findings and ideas and arguments of this book, which I'm happy to do. Let me start by saying, I mean, it's a history of Europe since 1945 that takes stock of the kind of arc of developments on the continent since the end of the war 75 years ago. But I should make it clear that the book is not a survey. Rather, it aims to reinterpret the remaking of Europe from the ceasefire to the present. Now, as many of you know, the history of Europe after 1945 is a very crowded field. There are many other distinguished historians that have been working in this field for a long time, including Tony Judd and Ian Kershaw, Konrad Jausch, Mary Fulbrook, Victoria de Grassi, and many others. And we're basically familiar with the story of Cold War division and stabilization in both blocs, economic recovery and integration and political reconstruction. What I've tried to do in this book is to take a different approach, and that's in a sense in 2 ways. The first is in a sense to integrate themes that are often left out of many of these other books. And that includes religion, empire, decolonization, race, and heritage debates. But this is not just an issue of adding these themes and stirring. It was really a sense to think about these themes as a way of rethinking the place of post-war Europe in the world. And so I really tried in this book to integrate Eastern and Western Europe, but also to integrate Africa. There's a chapter, for example, on Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal.
Could I ask all of you to unmute yourself? Otherwise, it's kind of hard to hear Paul speak. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so in a sense, in looking at Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal, and how these countries then recast European African relations in, or from a post-imperial perspective. There are also sections on South Africa and Rhodesia in the book. The second thread is in a sense to track the debates and actions associated with the defense of civilization. So in that way, the book explores how changing views of civilization led to a new politics of identity in an era of defeat, division, and the end of empire. After all, the very fallibility of European civilization stirred a diverse set of thinkers, politicians, activists, and reformers to try to rescue European civilization from the ruins of war and moral destruction. So in this way, the ideas of the crisis or civilization in crisis touched on the great issues of the day. So that included war and peace, religion and science, empire and anti-imperialism, communism and anti-communism. It was a key concept for describing and making sense of post-war Europe and its changing place in the world. So in that way, civilization was not a theoretical question, but rather cut to the very heart of who Europeans thought they were and wanted to become. Now, imagine for some of you, this is a strange departure point. Tony Judd, for example, is not alone in saying that Nazism and the Third Reich's genocidal war rendered European civilization the grandest of all illusions. It's a term, of course, we love to hate. We often put scare quotes around it, or we use so-called as kind of gestures of moral distance and disapproval. And there's good reason for that. Civilization, of course, brings with it a very heavy and unwanted historical baggage of 18th century elitism, 19th century war, imperialism, and racism. And this antipathy toward the term is probably best summed up by Mahatma Gandhi when he was supposedly asked at one point what he thought of Western civilization. And he says, sounds like a good idea, meaning it's a story of kind of brutality and hypocrisy. But what I found interesting is that we have a lot of histories of suspect terms like fascism, race, and now white privilege. But civilization, for some reason, has not attracted the same historical attention. And I just wanted in this book to see how it's been invoked and how it operates politically. So in that way, I'm not an advocate for reclaiming the term. I just was interested in seeing how it's been used and abused as a kind of concept to mark out and map out a certain idea of Europe after 1945. Now, again, since the 1970s, the term has become more and more commandeered by the radical right, often in terms of keeping immigrants out of Europe. It has also served as kind of a crude shorthand for understanding the roots of post-war conflict. We're aware of Samuel Huntington's book on the clash of civilizations, published in 1996, this idea that we're all members of kind of unchanging regional identity blocks and kind of collisions of values drive then political antagonism. And today we have figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who often characterizes the refugees from Syria and Libya as an assault on Europe's Christian roots and what he calls European civilization, with echoes, of course, across Europe and North America. And then recently, of course, it's been a kind of racist ramping up of the term. You think of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, or the killing at the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. And if you look at the online manifesto of that killer, he said he was carrying out these heinous acts in the name of white civilization. So the tagline of civilization in crisis is suddenly a very, very popular theme in kind of 21st century politics, but we don't have much of a sense in how we got here or how this has changed since 1945. So the book's in a sense to try to kind of reconstruct this and see how civilization served as a kind of site or a place or a rhetorical device to actually talk about the changing maps and identities of Europe after 1945. So it's an effort to take seriously how people understood its meaning over time. So in that way, the book returns to the kind of physical and moral ruin of 1945 as a moment of reckoning and opportunity to see how Europe served as a kind of laboratory of contested heritage after the war. So on one hand, you have the kind of re-civilization of Europe, which is linked to peace and even progressive leftist causes. And so that could be, of course, pacifism, welfare state policies across the Iron Curtain, anti-colonialism, and multiculturalism. But on the other, it was often linked to conservative and reactionary countercurrents, the defense of empire, militant Christianity, racism, and anti-immigration. So what I was trying to do is, in a sense, acknowledge both aspects of what people used to call the civilizing mission or civilizing process, this kind of story of civility and violence as twin parts of the European inheritance. So the point is that the political language of civilization did not die at Auschwitz. And on the contrary, it reemerged as a central metaphor to ascribe positive meaning to physical and moral reconstruction after the war. So the book gives voice to the many people engaged in the reconstruction fever across the Iron Curtain and in various ex-colonies in the name of renewal and reform. So included among these voices would be speakers of people like, well, in a sense, be warmongers and peaceniks, preservationists and liberal modernizers, as well as European imperialists and African anti-imperialists. Now, some of these people saw civilization as singular and universal, others as plural and separate, but all parties identify the contest for civilization as urgent and necessary. So it's the very elasticity of its power that gave it such kind of valence after 1945. So one thing I discovered along the way when I was researching this is that civilization was, in a sense, it enabled people to think and act transnationally, because it was one in which people could think beyond national borders, to think about the continent of Europe and to think about Europe's place in a wider world. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, if I can, Frank, about some things that surprised me along the way. Is that okay? One thing that I found interesting about the whole discussion is that it was much broader than it had been before 1945, as well as much less elitist and even less Eurocentric, as various advocates and critics invoke civilization as synonymous with peace, expanded welfare states, social solidarity, and refined everyday actions. And it was also one in which civilization moved beyond being an abstract idea and encompassed a broad range of practical reform initiatives to begin anew. So this is not a story of elites just talking, but how civilization became a set of practices to remake Europe and Europeans. So this could include humanitarianism, international justice, and military occupation. Let's not forget that the language of civilization was fundamental to remaking Germany and the Germans after 1945. Is also included, cathedral and church restoration, again, welfare state provisioning, the peace movement, etiquette book writing, and many other ways, and the idea of using civilization to actually change or improve the world. So in a sense, the book kind of casts a kind of long kind of narrative arc in terms of trying to encompass the range of kind of case studies around this particular issue. I realize that I'm probably just going to bump up against my limits. I will say that one thing that did surprise me is that how frequent Eastern Europeans also use the term. I mean, for decades, it was associated with Western imperialism and was outright rejected by Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. But it does resurface in Eastern Europe, especially in the 1960s, as the socialist world's thrusting southward into Asia and Africa, in the idea of extending a hand to these newly decolonized countries there, often in the name of socialist civilization, as a way, in a sense, of softening the communist message to talk about what it is they had in common as developing areas around the world. That surprised me in terms of the frequency and the prevalence of the term in framing that particular interface, and also the importance of the term for a range of African political elites to turn the tables on their former European overlords, to talk about the importance of African civilization as a term of assertion, as a term of sovereignty and political independence. So we think of civilization as the most European of ideologies, but then it gets used first, in a sense, by the communist half of Europe, but then a range of African and Asian elites, in a sense, to talk about political and cultural arrival. So that was kind of interesting for me to think about. And the Algerian War becomes very important in this story in terms of the discussion of let's say, torture, as both sides, the Algerians and the French, accuse the other of barbarism and breaches of civilization. So that language is actually very, very central to what they're doing. So in that way, the book is a kind of, it's a post-war history of Europe that draws attention to competing claims of what civilization was and could be after Nazism, the war, and empire. It is, I think, in that way, one of the most cherished of invented traditions, and then how it was invoked, I found to be, in a sense, the most important thing. It's a kind of go-to term that enabled people to think about the place of Europe in the world and beyond Cold War division and empire. And that way it was a kind of story of the custody battles over European heritage in 1945. So I'll go ahead, if that's okay, and probably stop there, Frank, and then maybe we can take some questions, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you. I think you represented the book really well and its various contributions. And I actually think that my MMW students will recognize some of this because they're reading a section of Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism for this week. And of course, that's this really ardent critique of the concept of civilization, although you say in the book that he really criticized the European use of civilization, not so much the manipulation of civilization, not so much the concept itself. And he invokes a sort of African civilization as a counterpoint. But I wanted to start that, when I first heard about your book, I had a moment when I got really worried because I thought that, is this just another book that tells the story of re-civilization as the return of Europe to a sort of, unproblematic Western tradition in which this sort of Western tradition is always sort of decoupled from all its problematic aspects like, colonialism, racism, and violence. And I think there are some examples of that. I think, Yarau's book comes sort of close to that, right? But of course, I should have known that you're a much too good historians in order to write a history like this. So as you say, the book is very much shows the sort of contested nature of this concept and the different meanings, the ambiguities, the ways in which different people and groups made use of the concept. But at the end, I was left wondering, and I was wondering what you think about this. So, I mean, how important do you think this sort of more universalist, egalitarian use of the concept was in the end? And could you say that it was essentially limited to this 20-year period from 1945, maybe to the end of the 1960s, and then this kind of more conservative concept takes over again, as you describe in the last chapter of the book? So, I mean, that's the sort of contribution of the book, is to show these alternative meanings of civilization. But so, I mean, what would you, how would you assess the significance of those alternative concepts?
That's a good question. And you put your finger on it. I mean, I was really, in a sense, trying to write a different kind of European history after 1945 that also drew attention to the kind of wide open dimension of the discussion of trying to reclaim certain ideas of the European past, European culture. Because I think we're now in a situation in the 21st century when the term, as I said at the very beginning, has been so monopolized by the Reich that we forget it actually had this very open, even quite progressive history, I think, from the mid-1940s probably to the mid-1960s. And the fact that it was so closely aligned to, again, projects of peace, welfare states, a whole range of things to kind of build a better Europe, and then was picked up again by Eastern Europeans. I think part of the reason that it does have a kind of limited shelf life. I think by the time we get to 1968, and look at 1968, for example, no student activists would ever use the term civilization, right? It's not their vocabulary at all. They're much more keen and interested in a language of kind of rights and justice, freedom. That language is not a progressive language any longer to a post-war generation. So I was trying to get a sense of what had happened to it. And I think part of it is that it's used and exploited very well by the conservative right, including Christian Democrats. I mean, the importance of Christian civilization becomes a way of kind of defining the West as opposed to the East, and the idea of what we now call Judeo-Christian civilization is a really important Cold War term to link not just the United States to Europe, but also the idea that Jews and Christians also meaning Protestants and Catholics, can put up a kind of united front against the Red Menace. And these were all seen as kind of important markers of a new kind of Western identity. So that becomes one place in which it's a very, very powerful language. And again, with this idea of Western civilization, Atlantic civilization, and you do have a range of regimes, especially in Southern Europe, that often wrap themselves in the mantle of Christian civilization. Franco, for example, is very clear that in a sense it's, to change the message as kind of defender of fascism, he uses this idea of Spain as being a guardian of Christian civilization to, in a sense, accentuate Spain's links, wider links to the West and NATO links, etc. It's the same thing in Greece after the colonel's coup in 1967, same thing in Portugal. So I think these right-wing conservative regimes use the term as a way of justifying their political legitimacy. I think they do that very, very effectively, to the point where I think for those people interested in the more kind of progressive, even leftist readings of the term, it's one in which it essentially is associated with right-wing causes. So one of the kind of sub-themes of the book is why and how the left abandoned the term. And how did it drift then to become a very important right-wing term by the early 70s. I was also interested in what happened to the term once it left Europe. And again, I was talking about that these African political elites use it as a term of anti-imperialism, as a again, this language of political rival, using a regional idea of African civilization. And it becomes particularly important in Africa because older civilizations like China and India have been recognized as civilizations over the, all the way through the 18th and 19th century. African civilization as a civilization really is a kind of an interwar story linked to, figures like César and Senghor and in a sense, the negritude. And so by the time they're coming to power in the 40s and 50s, it's a very powerful term. But I think because it becomes a term, it's also associated with anti-colonialism. It's one in which I think for Western European conservatives is one in which they're interested in recasting it. So I was interested also in terms of what happens to the term when it's used in South Africa or in Rhodesia, in these areas in which you had white minorities ruling over large indigenous populations. And they would often argue that they were doing so in the name of Christian or white civilization. And my sense is that the way they see themselves as kind of under siege, as part of a kind of outpost of European civilization, that kind of boomerangs back to Europe in the 1970s. It becomes very important to these kind of anti-immigration parties like the Front National in France in the early 70s, in which this idea that somehow majoritarian French culture is under siege from immigrants and people of color. And so this idea that somehow this is, what now we get with people like Renaud Camus, this idea of the great replacement, it becomes very strongly linked to a defense of majoritarian culture, defense of race, and one to keep people of different races and colors out of Europe. So I was interested in how it was a very progressive and open discussion from the 40s, 60s, and then it really drifts to the right. Now, there are always exceptional voices. You had your Václav Havels, who were interested in the term in Eastern Europe, what he called technical civilization, industrial civilization. So it's not to say that was completely monopolized, but it certainly did drift over the 70s and 80s. And I think now we're kind of living a world in which it's hard to imagine that the left would possibly recoup the term. I think there are a little bit moments here and there where that has started to happen, actually, even with the pandemic. But I was in a sense trying to mark out that particular trend and shifts with the language and the idea of a European culture identity over this 75-year period.
Right. I mean, one of the great things about the book really is that, the story of Africa becomes part of European history. And as you just described in your answer, that what happens in Rhodesia and in South Africa becomes relevant for Europe. So it really does sort of locate Europe in the wider world. And I mean, I think with every conceptual framework, it allows us to see certain things and then it obscures other things. And I think one of the advantages of your approach is that it brings into views, themes and actors that are usually not part of these histories of Europe in the post-war period. I mean, you won't find anything about the UNRWA aid workers as the new missionaries in some of these other post-war, histories of Europe by Kershaw and Judd and Jarosz, or there's, you have this very strong emphasis on photography and visual representations. There's the story of this Hungarian priest, Mindszenty, as the sort of cause célèbre of Catholicism in Europe. The significance of etiquette books for, re-civilizing Europe. And I also really like this emphasis on this, 15-year effort of imperial reconquest, which also doesn't get emphasized enough in existing histories of Europe. It's always the story of decolonization, but we forget that it was preceded by this, extensive and violent effort to reclaim colonial territories. So I think this is all great that it brings into view these aspects. And then, of course, there are other things that you would read about in histories of post-war Europe that don't appear at all. I mean, you just mentioned it in your answer. So 68 is essentially missing. There's nothing about the student revolt, which is sort of seen as this big turning point often in European history. There's very little on the economic crisis of the 1970s, the rise of neoliberalism, all these kind of other stories that that get a lot of attention in these sort of, I would say, more conventional histories of Europe. So I was wondering, how did you decide what to include and what to leave out? And so did you feel, for example, that the student revolt didn't have anything to contribute to the history of civilization in post-war Europe?
That's a good question. And the real problem for me with this book early on was how to organize this. Because I didn't want, this was not going to be an N-gram survey in which is about linguistic usage, and that, that's boring. I also didn't want to have a situation in which I wanted to make this just an intellectual history in which you have, let's say, people, and of course there's a lot of that in the 1950s talking about the Enlightenment and inheritance and what, that, and that's fine. I wanted to really find moments in which often kind of middlebrow, or people were educators, people working in health, hygiene, again churchmen, in a sense, were just thinking about what they were trying to do with this. And as you say, religion I thought was really, really important here, and that has been missing from a lot of these other books. I did want to talk about the restoration of empire after 1945 as a kind of forgotten. It's not just an interregnum. That's often the way it's seen, right. The kind of moment from 45 to the kind of consolidation of Europe and the beginnings of the European Coal and Steel Commission, et cetera, as if that's a kind of parentheses. And I wanted to actually say that's actually a very, very important moment when they're back on the world. But it did mean that I had to make really strong choices. So I decided in the end, after a lot of thought, was to organize the book around moments in which the discussions of civilization become very public debates and controversies. So then it's about issues, let's say, of humanitarian aid. What does it mean to actually go into Europe as the new missionaries and be handing out food and provisions to a Europe that's had been doing this in other corners of the world for so long, and now in a sense is boomerang back. And you've got mostly kind of Americans, Canadians, Australians, and Brits in a sense now acting as the new missionaries in a defeated Europe. So that was a moment in which there was a lot of discussion about the collapse of civilization. I wanted to catch also how people, the military occupation of Germany in terms of what they thought they were doing with the civilizing mission, in a sense, turning it toward Europeans, in this case of Germans, issues of justice, then of course issues of, religion, empire. So I was in a sense, took a long time to find, in this case, 9 case studies that would get at the controversial aspects of what people thought they were doing and why they were invoking the term in the name of reform. I thought for a while, as I had done some research on the changing ideas of the term humanity. Humanity is a kind of cousin of civilization, but I think, it has a much softer, probably more progressive, more, it's more, it's linked more to peace, secularism. It just didn't generate the same amount of controversy and didn't generate the same amount of debate. And so in that way, civilization is such a fraught term with such a, well, you can argue dark and toxic legacy that to use it, it became a real claim and assertion. So at various moments, I wanted to kind of track those case studies as debates about European identity in that particular moment, whatever that was. So I guess the issue of building welfare states or religion. And I wanted also, as you said, factor in international organizations, because I think they played a very important role, and they're often given really short shrift. So I wanted UNRWA in terms of the humanitarian work. UNESCO, of course, is subject of a whole chapter, because they become very important into marking out this idea of world civilization. And they become a very important conduit, or in a sense, interface between the first and the second world, meaning between Western and Eastern Europe, and also between Eastern Europe and Africa and Asia, in terms of the idea of world heritage sites, taking Asian, African civilization seriously, kind of building all these links. And their good work, especially in terms of archaeology and heritage projects, starts to build new dialogues across the blocks in terms of what people thought they were doing, especially in terms of the link between ancient history and the present. One thing is that also is a kind of threading through the real interest. We kind of think of the Cold War as a story of modernization, always looking toward the future, but there's a huge amount of interest in the ancient past. And after 1945, with ancient history archaeology projects, and I was in a sense trying to say, well, what is driving that? And so it's often an effort to link the long past to the present in the name of new narratives of community. Very important, of course, in places like Africa, in terms of marking out new stories, anti or pre-imperial histories of the continent. So the trick, it seemed to me, was try to find those particular case studies. But as you say, it did mean that certain things just got left out. And that's what I was trying to say. It's not a survey, because the people are looking for, let's say, 1968, but it's not there. And for example, that wide open sense early on of the people that were interested in the term, feminists, for example, very early on abandoned the term. It's not going to do the work that they want for them in terms of advancing claims of equality, rights, and justice. They use those sorts of languages. Human rights, of course, as we know, is a very important moment in the 40s and then in the 1970s. That's a kind of universal language that is often much more practicable and actionable, as lawyers say, in the world, in the way the civilization is much more nebulous and vague. But I think it's because it's nebulous and vague, it can do a lot of things. But it is certainly true that there are certain things, like, for example, the world of labor. I mean, labor unions, they don't use the term at all. And even educators, and if you look at the 1920s, educators are often talking about educating the working classes in the name of civilization. I looked, and they don't use that language in the 1950s. Nice. So they may be using it in the colonies, but they're not using it back home. They don't talk about the idea of lifting up the masses through mass education. They don't use that civilizational language. So I was kind of interested in where it shows up and where it absolutely did not. But I was trying to hold up the idea that it was progressive and regressive, both in the 50s and 60s. And then, for whatever reason, why the left abandons the term, and then they choose a very, very different vocabulary to advance their political agendas. I mean, for example, in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the civilization language is not there at all. There are a few Czech figures that talk about it a little bit, the idea of returning to civilized Europe, but it's not there. But where it shows up again would be something like the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. Suddenly, it's absolutely everywhere. The idea that genocide is back in Europe. This is now again, this is a return of barbarism, the need to re-civilize the Balkans. Suddenly, that language that had been essentially forgotten for decades was back with a vengeance. And of course, 9/11 brings us back with it. So there are kind of moments in which it's activated and then used as a way of driving forward 9/11 in terms of kind of Islamophobia, a whole range of things. But for the most part, it's been one in which the right has been using it in the defense of the status quo. It's not linked to changing the world as so much as preserving it.
Right. Yeah, I think I had one more question, but I think you basically answered it already in your answer here, and that was, what is gained and what is lost by this shift from civilization to a language of rights in the 1960s and 70s, and that you also outline in the book. But I think you sort of answered that already, and I wanted to give the audience here a chance to ask you questions as well. So let's open it up, and maybe you can just raise your hand on Zoom or put a question in the chat, and then I can call on you. So Pamela.
Thank you so much for that really interesting overview. I look forward to reading the book. So, just as Frank was expecting, one book, and, he was glad not to see that, I was expecting to say, what about Spain? Which is what I always get to say in these books about post-war Europe. And then you said exactly what I was going to say about, Francoism and the defense of Catholic civilization. So that the left loses civilization, way earlier, right, in Southern Europe as a result, because it's tagged with this kind of Catholicism, which also, of course, brings a very transnational dimension to it. So that's another, Spain is sort of the beacon, right, for international Catholicism. That's how they portray themselves. So my question then is, how is the term democracy conceptualized within this, this sort of struggle over civilization? I was struck that word never came up, right? So how is that, how does that play a part in these debates?
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I mean, I tried as best I could. I'm not a Spanish specialist at all, to kind of fold in Southern Europe, in particular Spain, to the stories. I think Frank was quite shrewd in the way he uses that term. So shrewd again that I think those Southern European regimes, in a sense, mark out territory that makes it harder for liberals and leftists to kind of reclaim that. So that's certainly something I wanted to fold into that story. I mean, I was following, if you know the work of, let's say, my colleague here, Martin Conway, has just written a book on post-war democracy. And he does argue in that book that democracy after 1945 in Europe still has very shallow historical roots, and it's one that had to be kind of fought for. And there are moments in the 40s and 50s in which people talk about the trend toward democratization is also a trend toward civilization. Again, this is a Western European discourse exclusively. The Eastern Europeans don't speak about it in those terms at all. Again, for them, the language only comes in when they're essentially extending a hand to the developing world. But so there's a kind of moment in which there's a possible synergy between democracy and civilization. Again, early on, when it's linked to more liberal and leftist causes, and again, the construction of, let's say, welfare states, the building of housing, all this is seen as a kind of marker, an emblem of what the state is giving to war-weary citizens. And that's seen as a kind of moment of the kind of democratization of everyday life, not just in terms of your ability to vote, your ability to, right to representative, but the idea of living in new housing with, in a sense, affordable health services, mass education. This is all seen as a kind of package of the kind of material aspects of democracy, and civilization was often part of that discussion. I would say through the 1950s and maybe the early 1960s, and then again, once kind of Western, a kind of Christian democratic style is kind of bedded down, and the civilization is much more there to kind of as a kind of cultural justification for more conservative politics, the kind of, the relationship between the church and the state, in a sense, a kind of story of kind of more buttoned up decorum, kind of a guardian of kind of morals. And it's already, I think, in the 50s starting to drift to the right. But there was kind of a moment in which democratization, civilization were kind of running on parallel tracks. But by the time we get to, let's say, 1968, which for some 68ers is a kind of, daring more democracy, in a sense, pushing forward, or at least challenging what they felt to be the limitations of that post-war settlement in the 50s and early 60s, that language is just not there for younger people. They just don't see it as a kind of language of radical reform that's going to do things. So there are moments, I think, in the 40s and 50s when it's linked, but often to material concerns, and then it really is one in which they move in very, very different directions. Where it's interesting is in the 1970s in Eastern Europe, suddenly when they're talking about, when they're moving outside of a language of communism, and suddenly the language of democracy is still, it's there, but those talking about Europe And of course, that's a Europe that's, in a kind of détente world of thinking about the relations between Eastern and Western Europe. That will be the moment they start talking more about civilization. And, the figures I put toward the end, which I found very interesting, that actually resuscitate the term, or, John Paul II, when he talks about the idea of, European civilization. Of course, for him, that's a Christian-based model. And then in a really real surprise to me was Gorbachev. Gorbachev starts talking about, not just the common house of Europe, but he talks about the idea of bringing, the Soviet Union as part of a much larger story of European civilization. It's a kind of story of East-West warming relations. So that was one in which, suddenly you have, very, I thought, unusual characters, John Paul II and Gorbachev, actually as the guardians and the kind of champions of this idea of European civilization in the late 1970s, 1980s. So the term kind of moves in different directions, but it's often linked to various political agendas. I mean, for John Paul II and Gorbachev, you think very, very different worldviews, but they're the two real proponents of the kind of resuscitation of the term in the 1980s, which was a real surprise to me when I was doing the research, and what they actually meant by that and why that term was for them a term of revival, one about, in a sense, in both ways, East-West relations, it just from a very, very different perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Pamela's first point, I mean, the story of Southern Europe is really central in the book, and that also makes it different from other histories of Europe. I mean, there's a lot about also Portugal and the Portuguese Empire, and then also the importance of Greece, both during the Civil War and then the military coup in the 1960s. So I thought that was actually also really interesting about the book, how it makes those stories much more important for the history of post-war Europe. Next is our colleague from Amsterdam, Moritz Vollmer.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hamburg actually right now. Good to see you, Paul.
Okay.
Good to see you, Frank. Well, one of the sort of classic first things that come up for the historian of the first half of the 20th century is this dichotomy between Civilization and German Kultur. And of course, the classic on that one is Thomas Mann. And my question is, do you see does this have any post-1945 afterlife? Is it sort of lingering, a resentment somewhere on the German right that one actually dislikes this notion of civilization that is now imposed by the Allied occupiers? Or is the German right really just embracing this term civilization under sort of Adenauer's guidance?
No, it's a good question. And it's something I had given a talk in Munich, I was going to say pre-COVID. I can't remember that anymore. It must have been about a year and a half ago. And it's interesting because the West German left, they were really not part of this discussion. It's a little funny for me being trained as a Germanist that partly this because the CDU locks up this idea of Abendland so strongly, and that's a kind of surrogate term for the idea of civilization. But your point, it's still there. What ends up happening though, for the most part, it's then transposed into critiques of what is called at the time American civilization. So suddenly where that old German critique of civilisation, which is a kind of Anglo-French American, civilization of, superficiality, material values, it really becomes singularly associated with the United States and the kind of coming of American consumer culture and forms of, rock and roll, jazz, jeans, Hollywood, all that stuff that we know. And so the dangers of American civilization is something I found ironically actually unite Eastern and Western European intellectuals. They can all agree on essentially what they feel to be the terrible dangers coming from the United States, at least at the kind of Mandarin level. So that conflict between civilization and culture, that certainly is there, as you say, with Thomas Mann. It was there in the late 19th century, and it's very strong in the 1920s. It's hanging around kind of in a residual way in the 1950s, but it's very much the idea of worrying about, again, the dangers of Americanization. That's in a sense the way they talk about it. Sometimes they'll talk about it in terms of technological civilization, industrial civilization. So that's often not necessarily linked to the United States. It's much more about the coming of a kind of machine age. And you do have moments. There was a famous conference in 1967 organized by Erich Fromm, the great kind of Frankfurt School thinker, to gather intellectuals from both Eastern and Western Europe to discuss the idea of a technical industrial civilization. And the implication is that for all the ideological differences between East and West, a kind of machine-centric industrial world is actually something that everybody understands. And so the idea, the worries of alienation, remember Marx's early writings just came out or rediscovered and kind of and republished in the early 60s. That's in a sense part of the background. But so they'll talk about the idea of a kind of crisis or critique of civilization as a kind of something that links Eastern and Western Europe around this idea of a technical industrialized world. But for the most part, when they use the term, it's much more against the dangers of coming from the Atlantic world in the United States. That's pretty much the way they see that.
Okay, so before we move on to this perspective of early modern science, I would like to encourage my MMW students to ask questions. That's perfectly possible in that kind of event, and there's no need to be intimidated. Okay, Professor Westman.
Thank you very much. This is an absolutely fascinating presentation, so thank you. So I would be interested to hear what you have to say about the role of science in the post-war period. The 1950s is the moment when the term scientific revolution really becomes central to the historiography. And but it's revolution not in the Marxist sense of a class revolution, but in the sense of a conceptual transformation that was centered in Europe. So even while the cities are in ruins, you have particularly British and French historians writing using the scientific revolution. Very important that the definite article is in there to signify that it's European. The scientific revolution occurs where? Well, it occurs in Europe. So it's not linked explicitly with civilization as a term, as far as I know, but it's kind of used in the sense of a profound, peaceful, but also very European notion. And I wonder if that sense of revolution in your reading and studies is ever linked with civilization.
It's a good question. I didn't see that. I mean, it's not to say that it doesn't exist. I might have been looking in the wrong places. So that's possible. Where I was tracking that debate of science, which is an important part of one of the chapters, was the discussion in 1945 around Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with this idea that science needs to be re-civilized. There's a kind of feeling in which, the Second World War, and especially the destruction of atomic weaponry, revealed the dark side of science, or in a sense, a story of science without cultural control. And so there's a kind of feeling that science needed to be civilized. And so the discussion around that science needed to be turned toward the benefit of humankind, much more in terms of peaceful expressions. I mean, think of, for example, the theme of the 1958 Brussels World's Fair, the atomium, was in a sense the idea of the kind of control and the human benefits of the world of science. So that became, in a sense, a kind of theme of that 1958 kind of World's Fair in Brussels. And in a sense, it's already 13 years after the war, that's still a very central theme. And I was also looking at, for example, and this is kind of material that Frank has worked on, of course, beautifully, in terms of, the peace movements and this idea of anti-nuclear demonstrations in places like Britain and West Germany, this kind of, enormous atomic anxiety about, again, a kind of scientific world seemingly out of control, and the need to kind of rein it back in and give it more kind of cultural parameters. And so the language of civilization was often very, very central, at least what I've found, in terms of the idea of a new re-civilized world begins with making sure that science itself is being controlled and used toward peaceful ends. So you think of something like the Pugwash conferences of the 1950s, in which you get Soviet and American and a number of other scientists around the world to, well, theoretically share notes and collaborate with this idea of overcoming Cold War antagonism around scientific research. That was all seen as a kind of a gesture, or in a sense, kind of moments in which, you know, science would come under the purview of broader international organizations. So I was in a sense tracking that, in a sense, kind of broader international call. You know, Einstein, of course, was the center of this as well, and Bertrand Russell and a range of others, to make sure that scientists understood the ramifications of the research. And so that became a very important moment from the 1940s through the, I would say, the 1950s. But whether this idea of the scientific revolution in Europe, I didn't see that, but it could be that that became a kind of a new direction. But I didn't see that that was coupled or linked with this language of the crisis of civilization. So the crisis civilization, more than the language civilization, is in a sense what I was using to organize those case studies. And that the bigger crisis about science civilization was much more linked to, again, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and again about atomic research, and not so much in terms of scientific revolution more broadly. But like I was saying before, when they're having these conferences in the 60s about scientific and technical civilization, the idea again is one in which they're very worried about the relationship between science and progress. And the number of intellectuals writing in the 50s and 60s are very much showing a lot of anxiety in terms of what they feel to be, for all that language that science doesn't seem to have any obvious cultural and moral framework, and that's what they're calling for. But I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's in a sense the way I tracked it in this particular book. But it could very well be that there are things I missed or couldn't go in different directions.
Okay, Jörg Neuheiser. You're muted, Jörg.
Oops. Hi. Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you very much for sort of raising all these important issues. And I really look forward to reading the book as well. One thing that just occurred to me when you were talking about the crisis of civilization concerned with technology, science in the 1960s is that I haven't really heard the word modernization so far. And I think, especially if you look at the 1960s, 1970s, you mentioned international aid, you mentioned international organizations, that might be a place where a kind of progressive sense of civilization kind of survived the impact of the shift that you described with the 68ers. I was also wondering, you mentioned Africa a lot, you mentioned liberation movements there. I think this concept of modernization might actually have something to do with the way how Latin America feeds into this anti-colonial thing. I was wondering if the 68ers and their relationship to movements in Latin America would have continued to talk about civilization in this link with modernization. Thank you.
I was looking for that kind of thing myself, and I didn't see that. And I was really, I mean, there's certainly students, activists are very interested in what's going on in Latin America. They will talk about modernization, though there's already a sense of dependency theory, the sense in which, that modernization ends up being an enormous difference between the kind of rich and the poor around the world, and that, the international relations have become a kind of class conflict. Sometime early on, again, with the building of these welfare states, civilization was linked to modernization, the idea of building these, again, modern hospitals, roads, infrastructures. That was considered all important milestones on the way to building new polities. And again, that's something that was shared, of course, across the Iron Curtain. So some of it was linked toward modernization and a more modern future. But I found at a certain point that civilization discourse starts to look backwards. In other words, they're very interested in issues of heritage. Again, issues of archaeology and ancient history. I mean, one of the advantages of the term is that it allows people to think in a much broader historical continuum of what actually links the ancient past to the present with a positive or better future. So it's one in which it has a kind of elasticity of time built into it, but also an issue of space. I mean, when people are talking about civilization, they rarely, I mean, the French are the exceptions here, but most of the time they're not talking about national culture. Most of the time when people are talking about civilization, they're talking about things beyond the nation state. Now, it would be European civilization or Atlantic civilization, or it's regional civilization. Or it's, or let's say it's, you know, African civilization, or it's often one in which it's thinking in very, very broad terms, in very, very kind of transnational ways. When people speak of culture in the 1950s, they're much more thinking about national stories. You know, they're talking about English culture, Italian culture, Spanish culture, et cetera. But something about the language civilizations, it transcends the idea of the nation state, which I found interesting because, you know, the Cold War order is in many ways built on the sanctity of the nation state as the kind of bedrock of the international order, and civilization is still a language in which people are thinking outside of the nation state and thinking much more broadly historically. So it's a very kind of elastic term that gives people a chance to kind of situate their present in a long sense of time and an idea of space, which doesn't necessarily map onto the political nation state borders, let's say in Europe. So when they're talking about European civilization in the 50s and 60s, you know, there's the Iron Curtain and eventually the Berlin Wall. So when they're talking about Europe across the wall, it's kind of an imagined sense that kind of invokes much earlier eras in which they can talk about, let's say, Charlemagne's Europe, or they can talk about Roman civilization. And so I was kind of interested in those moments in which they're thinking very, very broadly and what they're doing when they're doing that in terms of, you know, trying to drive forward various agendas. So I'm not sure so sometimes it's linked to modernization and sometimes it's linked to a better and more progressive future, but there are moments in which it's also looking backward. And I think by the time you get to the 1970s and 80s, when the term is a very powerful one for conservatives, it's much more about the defense of the status quo. I don't think conservatives are thinking about modernization. It's not about change and reform. It's a desperate effort to preserve what they already have. They want to keep, let's say, immigrants out. In a sense, they're talking about the privileges that they used to have and want to desperately defend. So that's actually, you know, quite a strong thread. And that, you know, so that the modernization and the link to civilization by the 70s and 80s really drops away as the term drifts much further to the right.
Okay, thank you. Isabella has her hand up.
I just had a really quick question. I remember back in high school, I did a research paper for my history class in regards to post-World War II Hollywood. And the films that came out of Hollywood primarily being a complete transition into a sort of new film era in regards to communism and like film noir, how it was completely something new and different that completely shocked the nation entirely, and the use of Hollywood now becoming a sort of propaganda as to be anti-communist. And I just wanted to ask you on that, this sort of like transition, how it affected like the post-world America, because that's something that interests me as someone who used to do like theater and be really into like film and Hollywood, and still is to this day.
I lost the signal a little bit. So you're talking about the how, let's say, the civilization discourse affected Hollywood and the kind of anti-communism. Was that the idea?
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. Just because the sound quality, at least from my end, I couldn't hear it so well. That's certainly true. And again, the language civilization, I mean, I didn't track. I use, as Frank was saying, quite a bit of photojournalism, because there are moments in which the crisis of civilization takes a kind of visual dimension, certainly with the collapse of Europe in 1945, and during the Algerian War, I was saying, and then later. But so I didn't do a really deep dive through, let's say, film culture, but certainly had lots of films in the early 50s about the defense of Christianity, let's say, and the kind of, in a sense, what the fate. There are a lot of films, again, with this Cardinal Vincente figure about the fate of Christianity in the East, or a lot of kind of Christian themed films. One thing I actually find interesting, and I was going to fold it in the book and I couldn't do it because it just was too long, was the huge interest in Hollywood. Also, we kind of forget in the 1950s with ancient history, with Greco-Roman civilization, right, with kind of the Ben-Hurs and the Cleopatras. I mean, there are a lot of films. I mean, again, you look at classic American cinema from the 20s, it's there too. It's not to say it's invented, but there's a lot of interest in, what you get with the, I'm a product of that, right? In a sense, this Western civ narrative at most universities, the idea that the United States takes the baton from Europe, and is now, in a sense, the guardian of this Western civilization story in a global way. And that becomes an American way of writing kind of global history. But there's a kind of, film version of that, I think, with that Hollywood interest in Greco-Roman civilization. So I'm not sure it's quite answered your question in terms of, how anti-communism is certainly there in terms of, lots of films about, Manchurian candidates, the kind of dangers of brainwashing and the dark arts of Soviet science. That's certainly around, and some of that, especially in the kind of world of B movies. But there's also an interest in the Ben-Hurs, the Cleopatras. The United States is kind of taking the kind of mantle of these older civilizations, and now, in a sense, is presenting and promoting them around the world. So I was also kind of trying to thread the importance of the Western Civ courses as, in a sense, part of this. Again, those courses begin in the 1920s, but by the 50s and 60s, they're popularized, and they're very much geared, to help American students understand the place of the United States in the world, in this broader American cultural mission, which is partly justification for, let's say, military occupation in Europe. That the kind of Truman Doctrine, there's a kind of cultural corollary of having a military and economic umbrella from the United States over Europe in the name of this broader cultural story.
Okay, great. I just wanted to add again to the students that our attempt at teaching MMW, the making of the modern world, is the attempt to tell a counter story to Western civilization, one that is less Eurocentric. I'm not sure we always succeed, but we certainly are trying. So you're part of this historical transition as well. Oh, there's one more question, Bridget.
Hi, you mentioned that in the earlier talks of civilization, there was less of a focus on specifically Western civilization, and it opened up the term civilization to many other cultures. And I wanted to know how you, in your research, how did imperialism and justification for continued imperialism play into this story?
Good question. And of course, that is absolutely there in 1945 with in a sense, the restoration of empire. So when the French go back into France and the Dutch, not for very long, go into, Indochina, they will often do so in the name of a kind of warmed over 19th century language of the civilizing mission. And I have, one chapter on empire, which I found very interesting in terms of catching a lot of these empires when they're trying to make their case at the United Nations as they're getting more criticism from new members, from India, Ghana, newly decolonized countries, saying, what reason is, Portugal, let's say, in Angola, and the French in Algeria, et cetera, and watching these, these imperialists who, for decades have been very comfortable with this language of the civilizing mission and uplift and the rest, and now really facing a lot of international fire for, a language that, had been essentially common parlance for so long, and just, how much that particular world had shifted. And so that link between imperialism and civilization, which was, of course, is a very strong 19th century link, didn't die in 1945. It was, in a sense, reactivated for a while. And then it's certainly there with the Algerian War, with also echoes with the United States in Vietnam. But there are many, many people that are interested in completely, feel that that particular link has to be cut, especially people in the church. There were a number of progressive Protestants and Catholics that felt that they can't go into Asia and Africa and with their religious mission, given the, what they felt to be the unwanted linkage between Christianity and imperialism. And so they felt a progressive kind of Vatican II, progressive Catholic and Protestant churches need to, in a sense, face up to the complicity between Christianity and imperialism, and need to actually cut those links as a way of making a stronger moral case to Asians and Africans who were interested in Christianity. So a lot of it comes out of progressive voices within the churches, and a lot of leftist anti-imperialists in Europe, and of course a number of activists around the world that, in a sense, want to throw out the whole imperial project altogether, which is certainly their right to do so. And then the question is there anything left from the civilization program, the package, that's worth resuscitating? And some people think there is, and many more think that there is not. But that becomes a moment in which there's a possibility of thinking about what would a post-imperial civilization look like? Is there such a thing? Or is civilization so contaminated by the imperial legacy and that there's no chance to even think about a post-imperial civilization? And just one last thing, one thing I found really interesting about the pandemic is that I'm sure a lot of you have been following this, but there are a number of environmentalists and environmental historians that are talking about the idea of global civilization. And they often mean by that scientists across international borders need to share research, need to share vaccinations. And so there's been an effort on the part of environmental historians to start resuscitating the term, I think in many ways to take back some of this from the radical right and say the term may be possibly progressive and may have a future. So I was reluctant in the book my first draft of it was to say this is all very, kind of doom and gloom story. And then I thought, it's had a 200-year history. It's changed spots in many, many different ways. It's not to say that another 15, 20 years, it might be a very different story again. And I don't think it's our role as historians to predict, but that link between, as you said in the question, between imperialism and civilization has been there at the very heart of it. But there have been lots of efforts along the way to decouple that and then to think, what would that mean if we do decouple that? And can we think of something more inclusive, progressive, non-xenophobic, non-racist? And what would that look like? And I just think there are a group of people now, again, mostly environmentalists, that are starting to use that language so that, it may have a very different kind of future.
So if I can just make one more comment here, when we talked earlier about, this shift to the language of rights, which is so much focused on the individual, right? And maybe this is also part of our contemporary experience, that maybe that's not enough, because as individuals, in this context of the pandemic, there's only so much you can do, and that you need a concept that thinks more about in terms of, transnational connections, in terms of the interdependency of all of us. And so perhaps this is the sort of moment to perhaps think about an idea like civilization again.
I think that's right. I think a pandemic has broadened our views, and as we're thinking on a more planetary way, in a more universalist. So, what will be interesting to see is what language we use to describe Homo sapiens. Do we talk about this of humanity? I think we're probably pretty comfortable with that term. Whether civilization will do that kind of work to kind of think about the globe or the species, we'll see. But I think the pandemic has kind of forced us all in a much more universal moment. Of course, we've seen there's been a lot of vaccine nationalism around the world, UK being one place where that has happened. So there's certainly been efforts to block that universal thinking, but others have actually been thinking that this is a planet in crisis, and then we possibly need to think a little bit more universally. And the question is, what kind of vocabulary do we have to kind of explain and narrate the kind of future of the planet. And, you know, civilization may be part of that, it may not, but it has at various moments become an important story, not just for Europe, but for the world. And we'll just see how, we'll just have to see which way that goes.
Right. Well, maybe this is a good note to end on, that the future is open, but we might look to the past in order to at least make educated guesses about the future. And, you know, we've all experienced a lot of deprivation and loss as a result of the pandemic, but there were a few good things about it. And events like this one, I hope, are among the sort of opportunities that this has also provided. So Paul, I would thank you very much for making yourself available this morning and, you know, engaging in this discussion with us. I want to show the book again, Ruin and Renewal, Civilizing Europe After World War II. It's really a fabulous book, and a book that taught, I mean, I learned a lot about it about post-war Europe that I didn't know about before. And so this is really, it's very worth reading. So thank you to all of you for your attention, your comments, your questions, and I certainly do hope that I see all or most of you in person sometime soon, and maybe this will also be possible with Paul, and we're working on getting him over here. He is originally from this part of the world, so maybe he has other reasons to come back here as well. And yeah, with that, I hope you have a good rest of the day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much for listening.